Welcome to the Wheat's on Your Mind podcast. My name is Aaron Harries. Wheat's on Your Mind is brought to you by the Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. Our guest on this episode of the podcast is Romulo Lollato, K-State Extension Wheat and Forage Production Specialist. The role that wheat plays in global food security is unquestioned, but what about wheat's role in a sustainable cropping system? There's a lot more to winter wheat than the price received for the grain, and a study has now been done to analyze wheat beyond the value of the grain. Today is the second part in our series of podcasts talking about wheat beyond the value of grain, and that's why we've had Romulo join us again. Welcome back, Romulo.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Aaron.
We talked about the diversity of winter wheat first in that first episode we did. We want to dive a little bit more into some other aspects of the value that winter wheat can add to a crop rotation. And the first one we need to talk about is kind of its role in that cropping rotation, the impact that winter wheat has on the other crops in those rotations. So we've got pretty diversified crop rotations, obviously, here in Kansas, differing from eastern to central to western Kansas. But what have we learned about winter wheat, the benefit of having that in a crop rotation?
To do that, nothing better than kind of taking a retrospective look into all of the long-term trials that K-State has done over the years, right? Some trials that started back in like 1970s or so, and they're very carefully conducted and comparing different rotations, right? Some of them with wheat, others without. And since we have such a large gradient in weather conditions in Kansas, right, we can kind of break that by different parts of the state as well. And when we look at the western portion of Kansas, a lot of work has been done in the past there by Dr. Alan Schlegel in Tribune and some of the other experiment stations that K-State has on the western third, right? And so if we just think of the yield gain that we have in sorghum first, right, whenever we're having wheat in the rotation, essentially Alan was comparing there many different types of rotations, and one of them was if they are comparing continuous sorghum, so sorghum after sorghum every year, or sorghum after wheat, right? And essentially, he started that study in 1996 and ran it until 2016, roughly. And essentially, in the beginning, there was probably around a 10 bushel advantage of sorghum after wheat. And that advantage increased over years, right? So that in the end of the study, 20 years later, we were seeing about 30 bushels advantage sorghum after wheat as compared to sorghum after sorghum, right? And so, I mean, we're looking at a yield level of around 60 bushels. If you're adding 30 on that, that's a lot, right? That's a huge yield gain there. And so what drives this, right? If we think what is actually driving these yield changes in that specific case of sorghum, and that's what's neat about all of Alan's work, was that he had a lot of very detailed measurements, including soil water, right? At depth, soil water down to about 6 or 7 feet in the profile. And essentially that explained a lot of that better performance sorghum after wheat compared to sorghum after sorghum. At planting for that sorghum crop, there was about 1.3 inches more available water in that 7 feet soil profile. So again, a lot more water there that it really explains much of that yield gain on the sorghum after wheat. And the greater water, we can talk about it here in a little bit, but a lot of that is actually due to that wheat residue, right? And that very thick wheat residue just helping conserve soil moisture during the fallow period.
Yeah, that's a lot of great data by Alan going, as you said, all the way back to 1996. So it's nice to see the trend line on that. That's with grain sorghum, and obviously we're kind of seeing similar results with dryland corn also, right?
Absolutely. So he had, in terms of corn, he had other kind of studies out there, some of them comparing wheat corn fallow with wheat corn sorghum fallow and wheat sorghum corn fallow. So that phase, the summer crop, switching around a little bit there. And if we take a look at those results and just look at the dryland corn yields, keeping in mind, right, that these were fairly low yields. We're talking maybe about the 35, 40 bushel per acre crop on whenever it's following sorghum. So corn after sorghum yielding over 10 years there, over 16 years, yielding about 27 bushels per acre, fairly low yields, right? But corn after wheat yielding about 42. So we're talking about, 15 bushels per acre, or if you look at it in a percentage-wise, 54% increase in the yield of corn following wheat as compared to corn following sorghum. And then we try to understand a little bit of what's going on behind, and it's a kind of very similar story to what we had in sorghum, which comes back to the available water at the date of corn planting. Right, we're looking if corn is following sorghum, there was about in that 7-foot profile, there was about 4.8 inches of available water, and this compares to about 5.8 inches of available water if corn was following wheat. And so a full inch of available water more, right? And corn is fairly efficient in using that water, so that full inch could translate in a good 15 bushels per acre or so. Again, about 20% increase in soil water when corn was following wheat as compared to corn following sorghum. So those results that we saw in sorghum also translating to the corn crop when we're looking dry land in western Kansas.
So what about as we move into central Kansas and start putting soybeans in the mix?
Now here we're going to look at some data this was an experiment conducted by Dallas Peterson, right? Dr. Dallas Peterson, weed specialist. Many of you guys there probably know Dallas. And we're going to look at 43 years of data. I mean, this was a long-term experiment, right? Started in 1975, and he ran it through 2018, right? Very long. And he was having either continuous soybeans or soybean wheat in rotation, right? And there are other treatments too in terms of sorghum there and rotation of soybean with sorghum as well without wheat and so on. But if we're just comparing here continuous soybean with soybean after wheat in rotation, across all of those 43 years of data, there was about a 12 bushel per acre benefit on soybean when it's following wheat as compared to soybean following soybean. And that was irrespective of tillage practice, right? This trial had different rotations in combinations with either no-till, reduced till, or conventional till. And that 12 bushel per acre was very consistent across tillage practices, again, benefiting soybean after wheat as compared to continuous soybeans. And it was interesting because if we break this down by harsh environments, like the lowest yielding environments, dry and so on, there was actually this benefit goes to about 15, 16 bushels per acre. So it's much greater in those harsh environments. We're talking going from 15 to 30 bushels per acre in soybeans. A huge difference, right? In the better environments, when we're looking at maybe around 50 bushels per acre soybean here, the difference range there from 6 to 8 bushels per acre is still significant, right? Again, the biggest benefits were in the harsh environments. And that kind of comes back to, again, that residue that the wheat brings to the story here, which is good for moisture retention, also good for weed suppression, especially important here in summer crops. And in the case when we're comparing to a continuous crop, breaking disease cycles, insect cycles also become very important.
Yeah, that's impressive, that 12 bushel gain in soybeans, and neither one of us is an ag economist, but when you start putting dollar amounts to that, and we talk about the profitability of an entire crop rotation, it's important to take that in consideration, how wheat contributes to that. I suppose to be fair, we should talk about, there are some benefits here, obviously, winter wheat in the rotation to those other crops, but I suppose there are some challenges too. A lot of times you can get a lot of straw like we had this past summer in a lot of places. That could probably present some challenges too in terms of soil temperatures and crop emergence and things like that.
Yes, when we have an excessive amount of straw, right, especially in higher yielding years, so it's important to remember that the amount of straw produced is going to be, most of the times, very related to the yield that is being harvested out of that field, right? So in higher yielding years, there is a tendency of a lot of straw being left behind, which has all of its benefits, but also brings some challenges, right? That's part of the reason why in wetter regions like the eastern U.S., it's very common to bale the residue out, right? So that it's not on the way of some of those things like you just mentioned, soil temperature and soil moisture as well, especially if you're coming out of a wet winter like we are this year and trying to get a summer crop planted. So there are some issues there, yes. But I believe in the type of environments that we're usually exposed to here in Kansas in particular, right? They were either on a drier end, like semi-arid environment in the western third, or what we call a dry subhumid environment in the central part of the state. I think that the benefits definitely outweigh the challenge that the residue brings.
I would agree. Well, let's dive into a few of the specifics here on why this is happening, why we're seeing those yield gains, and we can kind of break it down into the different conservation factors that winter wheat brings. And so what that residue does, as you mentioned, it's the value, and farmers in central and western Kansas, the straw is worth its weight in gold, literally speaking. How does winter wheat help conserve that water? It's fairly obvious that it all has to do with the density of that straw.
Yeah, so essentially it's the density of that straw and also how we manage that straw, right? So there's two components there. And that density is kind of going to depend, again, on the yielding environment that we had in the previous year. So if you had high yielding wheat crop, a lot of straw is going to be left behind, and the greater the benefits that we're going to get from that straw, right? As compared to 15 or 20 bushel per acre wheat crop that almost doesn't leave any residue behind. And then it has actually cascading impact for the next, not for the next season only, but really for the next 2, 3, 4 years until we can get more straw buildup in on top of that soil to bring many of these benefits that we're talking about. So let's go over a few of them and kind of how it works. So that's one component, the amount and the density of those straws. But the other component is our management of that straw, which can include tillage, or in other words, incorporating all that straw and really not leaving any residue on the soil surface. It can include just harvesting with a normal combine header that is going to cut that straw and leave a lot of that straw laying on the soil surface, or kicking those heads out, right, with a stripper header and then leaving all of that residue standing. And depending on how we manage that straw, we have the more or less benefits and different benefits really from which type of management, right? So if we kind of start with in quotation marks here, the worst management, which will be tillage of that straw, right? Why is it worse management? Well, first, you have no protection on that soil surface, right? And so if you get some rainfall, that rainfall is going to cause some splashing of those soil particles, and that can just start some runoff. And in a worst case scenario, that can translate into soil erosion. And we're losing a lot of that very rich topsoil where most of our organic matter is. So really, we're breaking that soil structure, leaving no protection on top of it, and then exposing ourselves to potential runoff and erosion, losing a lot of that very rich topsoil. It also, because there's no physical barrier for those weeds, probably going to have a lot more weeds coming up. Now, we do have a better reach of our herbicides, right? Because they're not going to get into the residue, they're going to go straight to the weeds, but at the same time, there will be more weeds coming up. Not only water erosion, as I mentioned before, but also wind erosion. That gets super important in many years for us here in Kansas. So we're not protected by residue. It increases the chance of wind erosion from that soil, and it reduces the potential for snow retention. In a winter like are having this winter here with quite a bit of snow coming down, we want to make sure that we're saving the moisture from the snow in the profile for our crop to use here in the spring. But really, if we don't have any residue out there, again, that all of that snow might actually just blow away. And then with no protection, the temperature in the soils, they're typically higher. So again, out in the eastern part of the US, that's why they till, just to kind of have higher soil temperatures, more evaporative losses, so water's being lost from that soil, right? And so it dries up and warms up a little bit quicker, and they can plant corn or soybeans just a few days earlier there. So that's kind of what happens, an overview, if we don't have any residue protection there. As we add that layer of residue that is either laying or standing there, right, depending on how we're harvesting our wheat crop, but we're managing this in a no-tillage system, we start to counterbalance these things that I just talked about, right? So that water is not going to cause a splash in the soil anymore. It's going to slowly infiltrate. And so instead of having runoff and erosion, the water typically is more accumulated in the soil profile. Likewise, there's more snow retention, is in particular if you have standing residue. Then you have a huge difference in the amount of snow retention in the field if you're harvesting with a stripper header and you have that standing residue in the field. There is just a physical barrier protection against weeds, right? So essentially, as weeds try to come up, that residue first, it is a shade, so it doesn't let the sunlight hit them directly, so they can produce less energy, right? Less photosynthesis there because they're covered by the shade. And just a physical barrier as well for as they try to come up, right? It's just that there's a physical barrier from that residue that makes it more difficult for the weeds to come up. Also decreasing soil temperatures So their emergence is later in the year as compared to what it would be in a conventional tillage system. And again, just we lose less water, but soils are cooler as well, right? So it's all kind of interconnected there. And again, the important thing is to maintain that wheat residue out there, bringing all of these benefits that we talked about. And whether it is laying down or standing, it's more of a fine-tuning of that system. With standing residue, you will get higher snow retention and perhaps maintenance of soil moisture, especially over the winter there. It will be a little bit harder to hit those weeds with herbicide, right? Because you have all that residue standing as well. When you're spraying for weeds, chances are that a lot of that just gets stuck in the residue. But again, I think there's many advantages there to having that wheat residue out there, just helping with moisture control and weed control as well.
So let's talk about that residue a little bit. Wheat straw, mostly cellulose. How long can it be there in the field before it degrades? Depends on how much water you apply, I imagine, but how long can it be there?
There is a lot of carbon in that wheat residue, right? It's typically about 40 to 42% of that residue is carbon, and that prolongs its life out there. So for quite some time, actually, wheat residue can stand there in the field. Probably, what happens is when kind of bacteria is trying to degrade that wheat residue, they need to bring to an optimum carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 25, but it takes some time for it to bring there from the wheat perspective, right? So that wheat residue is going to decompose a little bit faster in the beginning, and then it stabilizes and stay there for quite some time. So it is an important source of carbon back into the system, and that stays there protecting the soil for many months and sometimes even years.
I was fascinated by this one stat here. We talk about baling straw versus leaving the straw. One of the studies cited in this Beyond the Grain paper was that the height of wheat stubble increased from about 4 inches to 20 inches. Soil water evaporation decreased by 20 to 50%. So that's quite significant. Lends more value to that value of straw in western Kansas. We talked a bit about soil erosion and how that straw can slow down the rainfall. Back on weed control, I think many people may not know this, but wheat does have some allelopathic properties. Please explain that.
Yeah, so whenever we talk about a better weed control due to that wheat residue, right, there's a few things that we have in mind. One of them, again, is just the physical effect of the residue itself, right, that we just talked about, shading of those weeds and also reduction of soil temperatures, delaying their emergence. But there's also the chemical way, right? So the physical is just a physical barrier, but the chemical way is what we call allelopathy. And allelopathy, essentially, the wheat residue can produce some chemicals that inhibit the germination, emergence, and growth of weeds, right? And these chemicals are typically released from the roots, but also from the decaying wheat residue out there. And so recently here, what we were trying to do to better understand whether that depends on different varieties, right? In my lab, we got seed from 2 different weeds and also from sorghum, right? Because it's important for us to see if our commercial crop is also going to be decreased, the germination because of that wheat residue. And we brought it to the lab and we tested it with water only. And we tested it with extract from a wheat residue from about 40 or 50 varieties, actually. And it was very interesting to notice that the sorghum germination was not impacted at all. Likely because it's a little bit bigger seed, right? And so it has more reserves and the germination happened with no problem. But essentially, if we look at Palmer amaranth and giant ragweed, I think is the 2 weeds that we were looking at. And we had up to 46% reduction in germination, particularly of the Palmer amaranth, because of that extract from the wheat residue.
You were basically making a wheat straw tea, right? So there's some chemicals from composition that you're talking about that are doing this, having this effect.
You're right on. You put in the best words that I could here. So that's what we're doing. We're just like blending that in a blender, that straw with water, getting it to a 5% solution to try and see, okay, what would happen with a rainfall in the field, right? And so essentially, we had a 5% concentration of wheat residue tea that we were putting either that or the water, and we got up to 46% control in the germination of Palmer amaranth simply by the fact that we're putting the wheat residue juice instead of the water. And so that's huge, right? I mean, we're being able to reduce germination of such an important weed from having allelopathic effect from some weed varieties. Now, not all of them. There were differences between varieties, and there were also differences between the location where we were doing this. But essentially, it does tell us that there is the potential for another tool in our toolbox to help control those problematic weeds in our summer crops. And when we talk about the other effect, right, this allelopathic is the chemical one, and the physical one, really, there is some older data from Nebraska that was very interesting. They were taking a look at the amount of wheat residue that is left behind versus what they were calling weed yield. So how much biomass of weeds did we have in those fields? And essentially, if we had north of about 3,000 or so pounds of wheat residue per acre, we were decreasing that in more than half the amount of weeds that were coming up, sometimes decreasing it in about 5 times. So really, that lower temperature and shading effect, the reduced germination of weed seeds, and the reduced wheat growth due to those cooler temperatures really helping control weeds after a wheat crop. So again, it's a combination, right? It's the physical and chemical effects that wheat residue has on those weeds, but really reducing weed yield in up to 5-6 times depending on how much residue we had out there.
Well, great, Romulo. I think you've painted a more complete picture here of getting details of, again, more value that winter wheat brings to the crop rotation. It is significant, and we will continue in the future our discussions on wheat beyond the value of the grain, and there will be some new Beyond the Value of the Grain publications coming out. Just follow Romulo on social media and make sure to stay on our website at kswheat.com and follow us on social media, and you'll see those new papers as they come out. Want to shift gears real quickly before we end this podcast. We're recording this the last week in February, and it's been a pretty rough winter for human beings here in Kansas. I was talking with our producer Dave earlier. We've had 2 periods of below minus 10 Fahrenheit temperatures this winter, one in January and one most recently in February. Can't recall that happening for a long time. Obviously, when you're getting down to 10, 15, 20 below, those temperatures, air temperatures alone, cold enough to do some damage to winter wheat. So your assessment so far of what we may be looking at for winter kill, I know in both circumstances where we had those cold temperatures, fortunately we had a lot of snow cover in places. So where do you think we stand?
That's a really good question. I think that's on everyone's mind right now. And Aaron, if you haven't seen that in a while, I don't think I had seen that since I've been in Kansas, because my history here is shorter, right? I've been here for 9 going to 10 years.
Yeah.
And we have had some pretty warm winters here in this in the recent past, right? Others colder as well, but not as cold as this one, at least it feels like. Let's think of a winter kill. And when do we generally see the highest potential, or actually, when do we generally see the most winter kill here in Kansas in our recent history, right, since I've been on board? So remember, the fall of 2014 was a situation when we had a lot of winter kill in parts of northwest Kansas. And that fall, what happened was temperatures were very warm. There was quite a bit of moisture at planting, and the crop grew a lot. It was a very big, very lush crop in the fall. And it dried out, right? It had moisture at planting, but so much biomass dried out the profile. And then temperatures went probably from 60 to negative something overnight. And that abrupt shift in temperature is what led to winter kill back then, right? Because the crop was simply not winter hardened. So we can see a lot of winter kill in those conditions. The other condition that we saw here more recently, I think it was the winter of 2021. Conditions were also the air temperatures became quite low, kind of similar to what we saw this winter, right? I think that it was February or so, we got to negative 20, or even less than that. I think that we got to negative 30 or something like that.
It was definitely closer to negative 30, yeah.
Yes, and so extremely cold temperatures, and there was no moisture at all in the profile. It was extremely dry, and there was also no snowfall, right? So it was a very dry winter with no snowfall to protect, and temperatures were extremely cold. At that point in time, looking at soil temperatures at the 2-inch depth, they got to low teens into the single digits in many parts of the state, especially north central Kansas, so that probably from Concordia all the way until Beloit or so, that part of the state, and we saw very widespread winter kill at that during that winter as well. So again, very dry soils, no winter cover, and temperatures in the soil that reached into the single digits, right? Now, this winter we did get very cold as well, as you were mentioning here. I don't know that we got as cold as negative 30. I think we got air temperatures close to the negative 20 or something along those lines. There was snowfall. Whenever there is about at least an inch or two of snowfall, it acts as a blanket, right? So it really insulates the temperature in the soil, and that temperature in the soil usually doesn't go below about 32 degrees or so, right under the snow. So definitely where there was snowfall, which was in the first time that the temperatures got low, that snowfall was mostly central, north central, and northeast Kansas. In the second time, it was majority of the state except for about some parts of southwest Kansas, right? So where there was snowfall, I'm not very concerned. Where there's no snowfall, there was no blanket of snow, we looked at the soil temperatures, and the lowest that we saw was about 20 degrees. In the first event, most of them were 23, 24, and in the second, they were again in the mid 20s to upper 20s as well. So right now, the growing point, the crown of the crop is below ground, and that's what we're concerned with for the majority, right? So looking at soil temperatures, it makes me kind of cautiously optimistic that we might have gotten by with much less damage than we did in those two examples that I gave you before that happened winter kill for different reasons, right? But in those two times, we couldn't really see much until temperatures warmed up in the spring and we really saw the crop greening up and starting to grow. So kind of that's what I'm telling growers now is like, let's wait a little bit. Whenever it starts greening up, we can make some of those decisions, right? Because what is on growers' minds now is, do we fertilize, right? If the crop has been killed. And again, talking about the flexibility of the wheat in farming systems, we have some time to fertilize where the crop is still going to yield quite well. And so my suggestion there is to give it some time. When the weather warms up and the crop starts greening up, we're going to have a better idea of winter kill or not. But because the soil temperatures have been fairly high, I'm cautiously optimistic that we're not going to see as much winter kill this year.
If there were a circumstance, and I think we saw some this fall, we had a very warm December, and there were some wheat in west central, possibly southwest Kansas that looked like it might have jointed first hollow stem. Those are not going to survive, are they?
Yeah, well, no, definitely not. So if they were as further along as you're saying in terms of jointing or first hollow stem and so on, they get much more susceptible to cold temperatures like. And it also, I wonder a little bit, because wheat needs 6 to 8 temperatures of cold temperature to turn reproductive, right? Mm-hmm. So it makes me wonder also if you're just driving by the road and seeing a grown field like that, whether it can be some sort of cover crop or some spring oats or something like these that are they're just for cover. But if it is a winter wheat crop that we're counting on it for grain, and it was that far along, it's not going to survive these temperatures.
Yeah, so it technically shouldn't have joined it, right? If it didn't have that cold enough period in there to essentially flip the switch.
Yeah, it needs 6 to 8 temperatures of, soil temperatures below 48, 49 degrees or so, right? Yeah. And so, as you mentioned, it was a fairly warm December. It can grow a lot and produce a lot of biomass, but it shouldn't turn reproductive, right? If it is a winter wheat crop. We have a few very short vernalization varieties out there. I think minimum maybe 4 weeks or so, but still we need 4 weeks of cold temperatures before it would turn reproductive.
Yeah, hopefully we didn't see any of that. Well, Romulo, that's great information. Appreciate you always joining us on the podcast. Down the road, we will talk a little bit more about wheat beyond the value of grain. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Aaron. I appreciate being here.
My thanks to Romulo Lollato with K-State Research and Extension for joining me on this episode of the podcast to talk more about wheat beyond the value of the grain. If you have any follow-up questions for us, please email us at kswheat@kswheat.com. I'm Aaron Harries. Thanks for listening.